High in the Indian Himalayas, at an altitude where air thins and sound carries differently, there is a lake that refuses to stay hidden. For most of the year, Roopkund is sealed beneath ice and snow, silent, inaccessible, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. But when the ice retreats, the lake reveals what it has been preserving for centuries. Bones. Hundreds of them. Skulls, rib cages, femurs, hands frozen mid-gesture. Human remains scattered along the shoreline and beneath the shallow, clear water. They do not appear buried. They are not arranged. They are not marked. They simply lie where they fell. Roopkund does not present itself as a grave. It presents itself as a moment that never ended. The lake sits over 5,000 meters above sea level, surrounded by steep ridges and narrow mountain passes. Reaching it requires endurance, preparation, and time. There are no permanent settlements nearby, no obvious reason for large groups of people to have gathered here, let alone died together. And yet they did. The first modern accounts emerged during World War II, when British forest rangers stumbled upon the site. At the time, the discovery triggered alarm. With global conflict underway, the bones were initially suspected to belong to Japanese soldiers attempting a covert Himalayan crossing. That theory collapsed quickly. The remains were far older. The skeletons did not belong to a single group, nor a single era. They spanned centuries. Different ages, different origins, different journeys, all ending in the same place. Roopkund is not the aftermath of one disaster. It is a convergence. This alone challenges simple explanation. Most mass death sites are tied to identifiable events: avalanches, battles, epidemics. Roopkund resists that framing. The bones are not buried by debris. There is no sign of structural collapse, no evidence of prolonged settlement, just bodies, exposed. Blunt force trauma concentrated at the crown, rounded injuries, not sharp, not consistent with weapons, not easily explained by falls alone. The pattern suggests impact from above. This detail transformed Roopkund from archaeological curiosity into something darker, something closer to a question than an answer. What kind of event kills dozens, possibly hundreds, of people in the same way in one of the most isolated regions on Earth, without leaving a clear historical record? Local folklore offers one explanation. According to legend, a king and his retinue once attempted to cross these mountains during a pilgrimage. They offended a mountain goddess through disrespect. In response, she unleashed a storm of iron-hard hail, striking them down where they stood. For generations, this story existed only as myth. Then science examined the skulls. The injuries were consistent with blows from spherical objects, falling vertically, with lethal force. Not from landslides, not from avalanches, from something closer to hail, but of unusual size and intensity. This convergence of myth and forensic evidence unsettled researchers. Not because it proved the legend true, but because it suggested that extreme natural events could mimic divine punishment so precisely that memory transformed into myth. Roopkund sits at the intersection of geology, climate, and human vulnerability. Weather systems here are unstable. Storms can form suddenly, violently. At this altitude, exposure kills quickly. Navigation is unforgiving. Shelter is scarce. A group caught unprepared has no margin. But even this does not fully explain the site. Why so many bodies remain exposed instead of scattered downhill by time and erosion? Why personal items, jewelry, footwear, were found among the remains, suggesting sudden death rather than prolonged struggle? Why different groups across centuries seem to have met similar ends? Roopkund does not feel like a single tragedy. It feels like a trap, not laid intentionally, but repeated by circumstance. The lake does not pursue travelers. It does not lure them. It waits. And when conditions align, weather, timing, human error, it collects. This makes Roopkund fundamentally different from places of disaster.
disasters end, Roopkund persists. It is a reminder that the Himalayas are not merely mountains, but systems. Systems that compress space, time, and survival into narrow margins. Systems where a single miscalculation is fatal and recovery is optional. Most of those who died at Roopkund were not warriors, not explorers, not equipped for conquest. They were pilgrims, travelers, ordinary people moving through extraordinary terrain. Their deaths were not dramatic in the way history prefers. No battle cries, no final stand. Just exposure, impact, collapse, and then preservation. The cold halted decay. The ice slowed time. The lake became an archive. Roopkund does not erase the dead. It displays them. And that may be more disturbing. Because unlike disappearances at sea, Roopkund leaves evidence. Too much of it. The remains stare back at the living, demanding interpretation. Not asking what happened, but why it keeps happening.
What unsettles researchers most about Roopkund is not the presence of death, but its repetition. This is not a singular catastrophe frozen in time. It is a location where death appears to recur, separated by generations, yet ending in the same silence. Genetic analysis revealed that the skeletons do not belong to one homogeneous group. Some individuals were local to the region. Others originated from distant parts of the Indian subcontinent. A few showed genetic markers linked to populations far outside the Himalayas. Different people, different eras, same destination. This diversity collapses the idea of a single expedition gone wrong. It suggests that Roopkund functioned not as a route, but as a convergence point, a place people kept reaching and failing to leave. Why here? The answer lies partly in geography. Roopkund sits along ancient pilgrimage routes that thread through the high Himalayas. These paths were not chosen for safety. They were chosen for symbolism. Sacred journeys often prioritize meaning over survival. Pilgrims accept hardship as part of devotion. But devotion does not alter physics. At this altitude, weather shifts without warning. Clear skies can collapse into lethal storms within minutes. Hailstones the size of fists are not theoretical here. They are recorded phenomena. When they fall, there is nowhere to hide. No trees tall enough, no caves reliable enough, no shelter permanent enough. A group caught in such a storm becomes exposed instantly. Impact trauma from above, hypothermia within minutes, disorientation, collapse. The skull fractures tell this story without language. Yet science alone does not resolve the discomfort, because even when a plausible mechanism is identified, Roopkund resists closure. It refuses to feel finished. The remains are too visible, too intact, too present. Unlike burial sites, which absorb death into ritual, Roopkund leaves it exposed. Skulls surface when ice melts, then vanish again beneath snow. The dead appear and disappear cyclically, as if the mountain itself breathes them back into view. This cyclical revelation transforms the lake into something closer to memory than archaeology. Each thaw reopens the question. Each retreat of ice erases the answer. Roopkund does not allow forgetting. This is why the site feels less like a tragedy and more like a warning. Not explicitly stated, but continuously reenacted. It demonstrates what happens when human intention collides with indifferent terrain. The mountain does not punish, it does not test, it does not teach lessons deliberately. It simply enforces conditions. Those conditions have not changed in centuries. What changes is who enters them. Modern trekkers, armed with equipment and forecasts, still feel the weight of the place. Guides lower their voices near the lake. Movement slows. Jokes stop. The presence of the dead alters behavior instinctively, not because of superstition, but because the evidence is undeniable. This is where people died doing ordinary things: walking, resting, traveling together. Roopkund removes the distance between the living and the dead. There is no historical buffer, no monument, no interpretation panel strong enough to soften the encounter. The bodies are not symbolic, they are literal. And literal death resists romantic framing. What Roopkund ultimately reveals is not the brutality of nature, but its continuity.
Storms that killed centuries ago can still form today. Exposure still works the same way. The human body has not evolved to withstand these conditions. Time has passed. Risk has not. This continuity is what makes Roopkund more unsettling than many disaster sites. It suggests that the past is not safely sealed away, that the same mistake or the same miscalculation remains possible. The lake waits, not actively, not intentionally, but reliably.
Science arrived at Roopkund with confidence. Bones could be dated, DNA could be extracted, injuries could be classified, climate patterns could be reconstructed. The assumption was simple. Given enough data, the mystery would collapse into explanation. It did not. What science uncovered instead was fragmentation. Carbon dating revealed that the dead did not perish in a single moment. Some remains dated back over 1,000 years. Others were centuries younger. A few were comparatively recent. The lake had not claimed one group. It had received many. This temporal spread complicated every theory. If Roopkund were the site of one catastrophic storm, the dates would align. If it were a single failed pilgrimage, the genetic profiles would match. They did not. The evidence suggested repeated encounters with the same lethal conditions across time. The lake was not an endpoint of history. It was a recurring event. Researchers identified at least 2 major genetic groups among the remains, one local to South Asia, another surprisingly distant, with genetic markers linked to populations from the Eastern Mediterranean. This discovery disrupted assumptions about who traveled through these mountains and why. Why would people from so far away be here? Why would they travel together? Why would they die in the same place? Each answer generated new questions. The prevailing scientific hypothesis, sudden violent hailstorms, explained much, but not everything. Yes, skull fractures were consistent with blunt trauma from above. Yes, historical climate models supported the possibility of extreme weather events. Yes, exposure would have finished what impact began. But science struggled with scale. How does a storm kill so many people at once without dispersing them? Why were bodies not carried downhill by erosion? Why were personal belongings found intact, suggesting little time for reaction? The victims likely died quickly, almost simultaneously, caught in open terrain with no shelter, no warning, and no escape. In other words, there was no story to tell, only an ending. This is where science meets its own limitation. Science explains mechanisms. It does not provide meaning. It does not resolve the emotional discomfort of standing among exposed skeletons at 5,000 meters, knowing that centuries of knowledge separate you from them, and yet nothing essential has changed. Weather still forms, bodies still break, cold still kills. Roopkund exposes a gap between explanation and understanding. We can describe what likely happened. We cannot make it feel complete. This gap fuels debate. Some researchers argue that disease or poisoning played a role. Others suggest landslides or secondary avalanches. Each theory accounts for certain details and ignores others. None achieve total coherence. And perhaps that is the point. Roopkund resists singular narratives because it is not a singular event. It is a location where vulnerability concentrates, where roots converge, where mistakes repeat across generations. The lake does not create disaster. It accumulates it. This accumulation transforms Roopkund into something closer to a geological memory than a crime scene. The mountains do not remember individual stories. They remember patterns. Pilgrims pass, storms form. Some do not return. Their bones remain not because the mountain wants them to be seen, but because conditions preserve them. Cold arrests decay, ice locks time. Thaw releases it briefly, then seals it again. The dead appear and disappear like data points surfacing in an incomplete record. For modern observers, this is deeply uncomfortable. We want closure. We want final answers. Roopkund offers neither. It reminds us that explanation does not equal resolution. Even if every fracture were mapped, every genome sequenced, every storm reconstructed, something would remain unresolved. The human experience of sudden extinction in a place that continues unaffected. The lake does not acknowledge the effort to understand it. It remains. As science reaches its explanatory edge, Roopkund begins to resemble a philosophical boundary, a place where knowledge accumulates but certainty does not, where evidence grows without delivering peace.
This is why the site remains controversial, not because data is lacking, but because data does not soothe. Roopkund shows us that some truths, even when uncovered, remain intolerable, that mass death can occur without villain, without intention, without lesson, and that the world does not pause afterward to explain itself.
At Roopkund, death does not arrive as an ending. It arrives as suspension. The bodies do not disappear. They do not decay completely. They do not merge into the landscape the way death usually does. Instead, they remain, paused between presence and erasure, revealed and concealed by the slow rhythm of ice. This makes Roopkund fundamentally different from other mass death sites. Most places absorb tragedy. Time moves forward. Remains are buried, scattered, or forgotten. Memory becomes abstract. But Roopkund refuses absorption. It preserves interruption. The people who died here were not meant to be remembered. They were not warriors whose deaths altered borders. They were not martyrs whose suffering inspired movements. They were travelers, pilgrims, individuals moving through a world larger than themselves. Their deaths produced no outcome, and that is precisely why the lake unsettles us. Human culture relies on narrative justification. We accept loss more easily when it leads somewhere. A lesson learned, a mistake corrected, a story completed. Roopkund offers none of this. It presents death without consequence. The mountain did not change afterward. The routes were not abandoned. The storms did not stop forming. Life continued exactly as before. Not all deaths matter beyond the moment they occur. Not all suffering reshapes the world. Some lives end quietly, leaving behind nothing but physical evidence. Roopkund is filled with such evidence. Skulls stare upward, not in accusation, but in neutrality. There is no expression frozen into bone, no final emotion preserved. The dead do not ask to be understood. They do not demand justice. They simply remain. This neutrality is difficult to confront because it mirrors the universe itself. The world does not react to loss. It does not pause. It does not explain. It continues. At Roopkund, this indifference becomes visible. The lake does not mourn. The mountains do not remember names. The snow does not distinguish centuries. Everything collapses into the same silence. In this silence, the dead lose individuality. They become a collective presence, not united by identity, but by circumstance. Their differences dissolve. What remains is vulnerability. Human vulnerability exposed at altitude, in weather, in isolation. This exposure strips away the illusion that history is a series of meaningful arcs. Instead, it reveals history as accumulation, of movement, of risk, of error, of chance. Roopkund is not a warning carved into stone. It is a reminder written in bone that the world does not guarantee remembrance. We often believe that if something is discovered, it will be understood. If it is understood, it will be resolved. Roopkund breaks the sequence. It has been discovered. It has been studied. It remains unresolved. And it likely always will. Because the true discomfort of Roopkund does not come from unanswered questions about weather or migration. It comes from a deeper realization that even when answers exist, they do not restore meaning. Knowing how people died does not explain why their deaths should matter. The lake exposes a gap between explanation and significance. Standing at Roopkund, one is forced to confront the possibility that existence does not entitle one to narrative, that death does not guarantee remembrance, that history is selective and nature is indifferent. The skeletons appear when ice melts, briefly, then vanish again. This cycle feels symbolic, but it is not intentional. Meaning is imposed by observers, not by the place itself. Roopkund does not tell a story. It interrupts one. An interruption, without resolution, is deeply unsettling to a species that craves continuity. In the end, Roopkund Lake is not about mystery. It is about fragility. Fragility of the body in extreme environments, fragility of memory without witnesses, fragility of meaning when death leaves no echo. The lake does not accuse humanity. It does not judge ambition or faith. It simply demonstrates what happens when ordinary people cross extraordinary terrain at the wrong moment. They die, they remain, and the world moves on. That may be the darkest truth Roopkund offers. Not that many died here, but that nothing changed afterward.
Note the radiating fracture lines extending from the point of impact on the crown. We need to document the precise measurements here.